what that acceleration then does in terms of economic growth and change. But that's the main effect that they produce. So let's see. Yes, so our work really, so I gave you sort of a general picture that was historical, but now I want to tell you a little bit about actual data, including some stuff about Brazil. So a lot of our work and a lot of work in complex systems in other areas is really now empirically based. It's based on large amounts of data that we can use to explore old and new ideas about how these systems work. And so we try to get cities from all over the world. There are about 4,000 cities, about 100,000 people in the world today, more or less. And there are millions of neighborhoods, like the ones I showed you for New York and Cape Town, and then there are billions of people. So that gives you a sense of scales. And when we look at cities, this is the kind of thing that we always see in terms of several of the quantities I'm going to show you. So this is now called scaling. It's something very, very, very simple that we do in complex systems a lot. And it's basically compare a variable on the y-axis. In this case, we have wages for people in American cities. These are all American cities. And on the y-axis, on the x-axis, I'm sorry, you have population. So, and this is simply showing that that line that describes the data, and what you have there also is 40 years of data that I collapsed by adjusting for economic growth and population growth, so that all years fall on the same center. So what you see there is that basically wages, okay, and this is a log-log plot, so that's the last ingredient. So what you see there is basically for the economists the elasticity of wages to population size. And what you see there is that basically they increase per capita with city size. So that slope is larger than the slope which is in the dotted line. And that means that in larger cities like New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Sao Paulo, Rio, you get more money per unit time with your labor. So you make more money on average. I'll show you a little bit about how that's distributed later. But this is a very important point. It's again at the root of that urban economic miracle. The idea that in larger cities, what people do with that time on average here actually commands more money. So that's the increase in labor productivity, which is also an increase in other kinds of productivity. So that's true for 40 years in the US. This is kind of noisier because it includes China, which is sort of that gray cloud there. But Brazil is hidden in there as well, and it has a very similar effect. I use definition of cities in Brazil in terms of metropolitan areas, not municipalities, but you get a similar effect, and this has been done by some teams in Brazil since. And this is basically other socioeconomic quantities that once you adjust for their scales, you can put on the same plot. So what we see is that with city size, you get this increased productivity of socioeconomic quantities per capita per unit time everywhere in every city. So the baseline is different. In Brazil, people make a little bit less money maybe than in the United States or in Japan. But in Sao Paulo, they'll make more money than in a smaller city. They also, of course, spend more money. You make more money, you spend more money, you know. So that's the way it goes. Everything just accelerates, but it doesn't mean necessarily that you're ahead. So that was basically scaling, is the fact that all these properties change with scale in certain ways. This is also true in that plot. There's crime in there and other things that are not good. So crime is also a social contact, so it obeys more or less the rough dynamics I told you about. And so the idea is that cities really are balancing the things that are good socially and bad socially, and they need to regulate or find policy solutions to eliminate the bad things and emphasize the good things. But that's really important because it means that the problems of large cities are really that you are in an environment with larger productivity, with more money, therefore, to spend, but also of higher attrition, more crime, potentially, more congestion. So you have different problems from a small city where basically there's less money, but these problems are not so prevalent. But this actually has a very quantitative expression that you can say what it is. Okay. The other part is this. I already said this is Stockholm. Stockholm has these beautiful subway stations. But again, to illustrate this point, does the city have good infrastructure because it is rich, or is it rich because it has good infrastructure? Stockholm's a good example. Their subway system was planned in 1941. It was starting to be built in 1950. At that time, Sweden was not as rich as it is today. And so really, it's a system that co-evolved with economic development. And this is typical. So it's often a problem with interventions in developing nations. Brazil is not quite so much in that category, but if you go certain poorer parts in Africa or even parts of India, you have a very sophisticated solution that's plopped in a context where costs are much lower and perhaps the logistics and know-how is not there to maintain it, and that often leads to a disaster. So this idea that of circular causality also plays this idea of evolutionary dynamics, so this Shanghai before and after, that actually what happens in cities is co-evolving in terms of providing essentially the same service, like a subway system or other transportation system, but in a way that evolves in terms of convenience, quality, but also higher cost, as the society also develops in terms of what it can afford, what it wants in terms of comfort and time. So this is just amazing, right? I mean, look at that. This is just the built environment, but China, for good and bad, is really the place where urbanization is really going fastest. And this is raising a lot of people out of poverty, but also creating all kinds of other problems. I won't go into those, but basically that's the challenge. Okay, so now I want to spend just a little bit of time on specifically, even more specifically than before, what these properties mean, and then I want to go to policy. So I'll speed up a little bit, but hopefully we can catch up in question time. So this is what I already told you, is basically on the right there, you have GDP of American cities. Again, Brazil looks similar, has fewer large cities, and what you have on the left is the volume of roads in American cities. And so the black line is just a proportionality line. It would say that you'd have the same volume of roads or the same GDP per capita as cities grow. But what you see is that you get less road and more GDP. So there's basically a spatial compression, if you want to simplify what this is, and sort of an enhancement of interactions and socioeconomic processes. And this can be explained by general theory that I published on, and I'm not going to show you all the math, but basically that predicts these effects, these 10 or 20% by which GDP happens with every doubling of city size, but also how space gets shorter and used more intensely. And this predicts a bunch of interesting things. So this is something actually that in the comments in the chapter, Bernardo asked me to comment on. So you can predict, how big the highways are in a city of a given size with a certain transportation technology. You can say how many interactions per capita somebody might have in a city of a certain development. But one very important variable is the price of land, okay? So the price of land is very important for policy. And the value of land rents, not floor space, land, increases faster than incomes. And that's because it compounds these two effects I told you about, the spatial compression and the productivity per capita. So when you put these two things together, it means that land rents go up faster than incomes. And this changes the way cities are because it forces infrastructure to go underground and overground, but also gives you a model, certainly in the United States this is the prevalent model, to capitalize development. So what happens is that services are usually paid for through taxes on land. And this is usually the model that led also to some of the DeSoto proposals and so forth for poor neighborhoods. That if you could capitalize land in cities, you have a way to ask people to pay taxes on the idea that they're going to have better services and that the city is growing and that the land that they own is going to be worth more money. So under that logic, this is basically how the Western United States was built, was that there was a lot of infrastructure built, but people were willing to pay taxes because the cities were growing. So that was the model, and it's a model that works well, but also doesn't work well when it runs the other way. So Detroit in the United States, or post-industrial cities in general, are cities where people leave, where land values go down, where services get underinvested, where more people leave, and runs this virtuous cycle of development backwards, so that the city in some sense dissolves and disappears. So this circular causality plus these properties really leads to people leave, where land values go down, where services get underinvested, where more people leave, and runs this virtuous ways in which you start getting a sense of how policies may promote or destroy virtuous or vicious cycle. So this is just to demonstrate now the effect of interactions. This is from my native Portugal, but you can see that this is using cell phone data just to show you how you can use some new data, that these effects that these ideas predict are correct, but also that people have well-knit social networks. So a lot of your friends still know each other, even though you have more social interactions in cities. I'll just flash that. This is basically saying something that I haven't told you yet, which is you'll see that Brazil and Colombia and Mexico, what you're seeing there are homicides in cities. So as you know, in Latin America, one of the big obstacles to development in cities anyway has been high levels of violence. I think the World Bank has estimated across all Latin America, so it's crude, that about 14% of GDP annually is foregone to violence, because not only of direct violence, but all the investments and things that people do because of violence. And so we wanted to study these three countries because, Mexico in some sense is getting worse, Brazil in many places getting better, and maybe Colombia also has been getting better. But what you see there is that these three countries actually look essentially the same in terms of their statistics of crime once you account for the scaling. So that pixelation that I was showing you for neighborhoods actually has a statistical signature that's very predictable and that one can say something about. And this is what that is showing. So the heterogeneity of cities is actually quite simple in a certain specific way. And this is, I don't know the authors actually, but this is work that followed up on ours applying a lot of these ideas to Brazil. So the reference is there, and they have a couple other papers showing that, again, GDP and other things, but also other issues with human development tend to improve in Brazilian cities. Unemployment is an exception that also basically goes up with city size. So this is one of the problems of your large cities, is that they have a lot more unemployment, but they also have better access to services. So sort of there's a disjunction there in terms of what Brazil is doing in terms of its development. Okay. So this now uses, this is going back to their first plot about New York, but uses ideas now. I'm trying to speak a little bit to methods. So I told you about scaling, I told you about some statistics, and this basically uses ideas of information theory to tell you something that I think is interesting. So that map now has different colors, I hope you notice. And what it's showing, it's again New York, if you know New York, so that's Manhattan in the middle. And it's showing by neighborhood which neighborhoods are reflections of the city in terms of income distribution. So which neighborhoods look just like the city as a whole, and which neighborhoods show very strong deviations from the city. So basically what happens is that the experience of inequality is very different locally from what it is at the citywide or what it is nationwide. Because, so what happens here is that the plot there on the left, it's done by Joe Haddon in our group, is basically showing you that the Gini coefficient, the usual measure of inequality, is lower when you compare yourself to your neighbors, just your neighbors in your neighborhood, of course, than citywide. So people compensate for these growing inequality, and land markets probably do, in terms of creating places that have very different land rents, very different distributions of income, such that you end up with, yes, rich neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods, but within those neighborhoods, the experience is much more homogeneous. So there's this basically adjustment across scales that you can capture using methods of information theory that tells you which neighborhoods are really, so for example there, I can't show you there, but that's Central Park there in red, shouldn't be red, but you see the neighborhoods adjacent to it in red are very rich, and therefore they actually are very unlike the rest of the city. But these ones here in Brooklyn, over there, in Harlem and Bronx, are also very unlike the city, and that's because they're very poor. So you see, there's all this structure. This basically allows you to say how much information there is in the structure of the city as you go to finer and finer scales. And we have data now from poor neighborhoods, mostly through our partners at Slum Dwellers International, that show that this type of distribution goes all the way down to the individual. So when you look at a poor neighborhood, you tend to have these very broad distributions again. So this I'll show you quickly, but I think you have data for Brazil, and it's just starting to get to something that's interesting, which is how is it that we're all different in cities? So this is abstract, but what it's measuring there is the number of different professions in cities of different sizes. I've seen data for Brazil on this, Bernardo, and you guys have it in the secret room maybe, from Bernardo, from Hausman Ricardo Hausman in Harvard. They had data for Brazil. But I'd like to see what that looks like. But basically in larger cities you tend to have more different professions. So you likely the opera singer in Brazil, maybe they live in Manaus, but maybe they live in São Paulo or Rio, or the hat maker, but of course you have, you know, people work in service industries everywhere. So that's basically what this shows. But what this tells you is that this plays to old ideas of regional economics and urban hierarchy, that larger and larger cities have more and more kinds of special services and occupations that people take. But those then service larger areas beyond the city. So this is what integrates the urban system together. So I don't know, in Brazil the obvious thing to say is that in São Paulo, for example, you have more financial services. In Brasilia, of course, you have government. And these things integrate across the country. But many of these things that are economic really integrate typically at larger cities first. Brasilia, of course, is built that way. But and then smaller places have a subset only of those things. They are more specialized to be used locally. And so, but what happens that's interesting is that therefore larger cities promote this specialization and division of labor, which is sort of the basis of economic ideas. And so I just want to get to that and then before I get to policy. So what we see a lot then when we look at poor neighborhoods and rich neighborhoods through some of these data sets I alluded to is, and when we look at poor nations and rich nations and also through history, is this differentiation that happens through social connectivity. So this is what sort of happens in cities and happens with development in cities, which is that if you go to a very, very poor and simple society where people maybe are farmers, and Brazil used to be a lot like that, you have people